Foreshadowing, a term that almost everyone has heard of, a literary device that's used to indicate something that will happen in the future of a story. Sometimes good foreshadowing is obvious, Chekhov's gun, for example. But sometimes great foreshadowing is snuck under the guise of a scene so multifaceted you don't even realize it's there until you revisit it. I think almost all of my favorite stories are great in their first viewing, but also offer immense depth through scrutiny in repeat viewings. I'm not talking about when a twist recontextualizes everything, but more specifically when there are layers and depth to a story that initially go unnoticed, almost feeling like they're placed there with disregard to the fact that they might be missed. A secret for those who are looking closely. Welcome to a running series called Exploring Frieren. My name is Pei, and today we're talking about when important information was right in front of you from the very start. Frieren Beyond Journey's End is a story about recontextualizing past experiences through new ones, engaging in the world around you and relationships in order to not live a life you regret. It's built around a fantastic pilot that was the primary catalyst for most people checking out the show. It explores all these unique stories in sometimes only half an episode. It's a show that has so much space with such slow pacing, but is also filled to the brim with engaging ideas and significance. It's so far from feeling empty or sparse. This will be my 26th video talking about Frieren, because there are so many ideas worth exploring, moments to learn from, both in the human condition but also from a storytelling perspective. Frieren has this remarkable knack of taking worn out and overused trope and somehow approaching them with a new lens or perspective. So when we look at Frieren's use of foreshadowing and symbolism, it almost feels like it's coming out of a high school English textbook. Yet despite its straightforward nature, it still feels significant, fresh, and engaging. And a really beautiful example of this is the way Frieren's writers used jewelry. For a long time now, especially in Western culture, rings have been incredibly symbolic. For example, the rise in popularity of the engagement ring, or wedding bands in their origin. Take the greatest of all time debate in basketball. One of the primary things they talk about is how many rings they've won from championships, class rings from colleges or high schools. Jewelry in general, but especially rings, are one of the most common family heirlooms. So it's no shock that rings have found themselves in the center of so many different pieces of fiction, especially fantasy. Arguably one of the most impactful pieces of modern fantasy media is The Lord of the Rings, which was inspired by the ring cycle. So when Frieren chose to use jewelry as a primary form of symbolism in the story, there were lots of opportunities for it to come across as cliché. But consistent with all the other times that Frieren engaged with trope, it never felt like they were engaging with the cliché as much as they were. A mix between sincerity, subversion, and emotional substance led to a very unique story, the opposite of what you often feel when watching something that's cliché. Even when you see what's coming next from a mile away, Frieren still finds ways to surprise you. A lot of storytelling can be reduced to setup and execution. In the past, I've argued that stories are meant to be satisfying, and I don't mean that in the most classical sense. I mean that ideas should feel consistent with the universe that's been created, with the things that have been set up, so when consequence or reward comes, it feels justified. So when good ideas or plot points fail, it's so often because they're not properly set up. That's why great foreshadowing is so important. Not only does Frieren have great normal foreshadowing, sometimes it sneaks in little pieces of information that set up beautifully the rest of the story, despite the fact that you may not even notice it. Spoiler warning for Season 1 of Frieren Beyond Journey's End. About 8 weeks ago, I released a video talking about arguably one of Frieren's best episodes, and the emotional crux for that story is all centered around this ring, which represents Frieren's relationship with Himmel, a central part of the entire story. What people don't know is that ring shows up in the first episode. Immediately after losing Himmel, Frieren is seen pondering rolling the ring between her fingers. And while the scene works great without it, context adds so much to the significance of this little moment. This isn't the only time this happens. It's not even the only time this happens with jewelry. Frieren's earrings might stand out to you as the only red in her character design, but it doesn't stop there. The design is reminiscent of her old master. Not only was red Flamma's color, but also the earrings are very similar in style. Hold that in parallel to the ring that Himmel gave Frieren and you can see this running theme, where Frieren holds on to jewelry that represents previous lost relationships, an heirloom of the past. Thurn has an obvious running motif with nature and butterflies. In the second episode, when Frieren is highlighting a special moment where a simple spell meant something significant to her that made her fall in love with the pursuit of magic, Frieren remembers a special moment from her childhood with Hyder, where she conjured beautiful translucent blue butterflies. There are layers upon layers of symbolism in Frieren, some of which may not even be on purpose, but because the show is so packed full of intentional and subtle symbolism, you give them the benefit of the doubt. You find things where things weren't even meant to be, and they work. Whenever there's a really famous artistic creator or musician like Hayao Miyazaki or Tyler the Creator, there's actually tons of examples, but those are two obvious ones. People often give them more than just the benefit of the doubt, because as their designated artistic genius, people find meaning in things that were completely unintentional, constantly searching for and finding significance in random happenstance. But I don't think that's a privilege that's undeserved, because so much of their art is packed full of significance, and the ability to create an open-ended, highly emotional piece of art that has room for interpretation is part of what makes someone great. So when there's this little shot of fern framed against a butterfly in the second episode, I assume it to be intentional, another string in a complex web of connected ideas, like the inverse of paranoia, searching for meaning in everything. Symbolism in Frieren is so important given the type of story it's trying to tell. It's built around theme and character, exploring big ideas around the human condition, like finding purpose in a society that wasn't built for you, or facing your fears and self-doubt. Here's a good example of finding meaning where it might not have been intended. Lots of Frieren's themes are explored in pairings, in juxtaposition of characters. What does it mean to act like a hero, both in big and small ways? That's explored in detail with multiple characters, but especially Hyder and Himmel. Or, like I mentioned before, finding a place in a world that wasn't meant for you. That applies to Frieren and Fern. Or, when you're facing and overcoming fears and self-doubt, that primarily applies to Sign and Stark. All three of these pairings have the same first letter. Was that likely done on purpose by a Japanese author using German names? Maybe. Could it be coincidence? Probably. Does it still add to this interesting juxtaposition of two very different explorations of similar stories? Yeah, absolutely. Fern and Frieren are both people who struggle to find a place in the world for very different reasons. Frieren's long life and Fern's upbringing both isolate them, and they turn to magic, something that provides purpose and direction. Episode 2 is titled It Didn't Have to Be Magic, but that's kind of the whole point. Both Frieren and Fern understand one another in their pursuit of something. In this case, the pursuit of spells and magic. Two very different characters with different circumstances exploring a similar experience. Both Sign and Stark have parts that they resent, decisions they've made in the past that they regret, fears and justifications as to why they didn't choose to participate in the way that those around them did. But this adventure is about both of them stepping out of their comfort zone and pushing themselves, growing and facing those fears. Frieren is such a character-driven story, explored through the support of all these clever little parts, like a butterfly hair ornament. I think there's tons of interesting ways you can explore the symbolism between Fern and butterflies. There's the initial obvious running theme between Fern and nature, not only in her name and all those little scenes of her coexisting with it, but also in the ways that when she's learning magic, it's always framed against nature. Butterflies are once again an object that has a lot of symbolism already established around it, representing beauty, transformation, and the renewal of life. Butterflies not only represent Fern, but her relationship to Hyder, the way she worked so hard to develop skills in magic before Hyder passed to demonstrate to him that she'll be okay, having a skill set that will serve and provide for her. Butterflies also work well in conjunction with her pious nature. And when it comes to jewelry, consistently throughout Frieren, it also represents gift-giving and relationships. Fern was unsure about her relationship with Frieren and how Frieren felt about her, but that gift provided clarity. And it happens time and time again, the bracelets exchanged between Stark and Fern, for example. Or, coming full circle, the ring that Himmel gave Frieren, which also represents this repetitive formula to Frieren's story. Frieren has something. She doesn't realize how precious that thing is to her until she loses it. Frieren then, in the search for that thing, finds some sort of purpose or significance, a lesson. Like in the pilot, Frieren has her relationship with the party, and more specifically Himmel. She doesn't realize how precious that is to her until she loses it, and the entire A-plot for this story is her searching for a final conversation with him. But the new adventure she's on, these shared experiences with all these different people, help her learn and recontextualize her previous adventure. And the same structure happens time and time again when she loses the ring in the forest, or when she's searching for the tome that Flamma left behind, or even in the second episode with the blue moonweed, pursuing something that she's lost, and in the end learning from that pursuit. I think Frieren is a peak example of a story being more about the journey than the destination, because despite at times feeling aimless, Frieren is a story that always has a point, supported by and built from a foundation of all these little components, trinkets, and parts, like jewelry, symbolism, and outstanding foreshadowing.